Okay. So what I want to talk about very simply in some ways is two words that we see reoccurring throughout Arendt, that we see in this essay, but that I don't think we can take at face value as Arendt's own words. And the two words are crisis and evil.
Sorry, crisis and
Evil. Evil, right. We hear about crisis more in these essays in particular, and so I want to be very clear about what she might be referring to in that word and what some of the sources are for that. She's more famous for this word evil, in particular this idea of the banality of evil, which is really the added subtitle to the New Yorker, to the publication of the essays that appeared in the New Yorker in 1963. But in both cases, there are very particular traditions that she's working from, and I think you should be as aware of that as possible. And so three characters are going to stand out in terms of sources of Arendtian ideas, and I think each of them gives us a unique insight. Two of them you've heard before, one I don't think I've talked about. The first is Aristotle. The second is Augustine. And the third is Husserl, or Edmund Husserl. As you probably heard from the interview, Arendt's undergrad training was in philosophy as a major, but with minors in theology and in Greek. And you could probably assume, I assume, because she's working with Plato and stuff, that it's Attic Greek, it's not the Koine, the New Testament Greek. So she has a sort of background as a classicist. Her idea of what theology is really interesting, and it kind of comes up at the end of this chapter, where this kind of political conception of theology, right?
What kind of Greek did you say?
What was that?
You said there is no biblical Greek.
So if you study classics, Attic Greek is the Homeric Greek, kind of working through Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, Aristophanes, classical, you could say, Greek. And then the Koine is the New Testament Greek, which was the Greek which was kind of the lingua franca of the Roman Empire at the time, which just separated by a few hundred years, the language kind of changes, So like if you've studied Cervantes in Spanish, and even if you're a fluent Spanish speaker, you'll be like, whoa, this is different Spanish, and it is. It's grammatically even different in many respects, but so there's a big difference between taking your language, at one point in time, and then many, a few centuries later, it'll be different. So Arendt's training is in, you could say, not just philosophy, but a particular humanistic approach to philosophy. So it's not analytical philosophy. So for analytical philosophy, the basic tenets are math and logic, actually in reverse order, logic, symbolic especially, and then math. Whereas for Arendt, she's working in this very historical, continental, classical tradition. This is one of the first reasons why I find a lot of joy, but also it's weird to me why she's so popular, because she's not really a modern person. She's a very classical intellect and trained that way in some ways within the German university. Second of all is the fact that Arendt is obviously Jewish. Her Judaism, though, I think, this I have to say is going to be, I consider just an objective weakness in my skill of making sense of her. I share a particular classical, philosophical, continental training with her, and on that I feel like we can talk. But I obviously don't share her Judaism, and so I always feel like I'm missing an extra element. But in some cases, I think that element does come out in the sense in which this isn't probably the only culture, but of all the cultures that have taken reading and almost forced it into a method that changes what reading itself is, it would be the approach of Hebrew literature, right? So the Jewish approach to study Torah, for instance, Torah lishma, so this idea of studying Torah for its own sake, is a kind of study and a kind of reading that goes well beyond the idea of reading for comprehension or reading for information or reading for pleasure or all these things. It really goes into a whole nother realm. You could say that like it's the force of language, the force of the word within this tradition is very strong. And so I think there's a particular Jewish notion of literacy that even as a secular Jewish woman, she definitely is a part of, and that also shows in addition to her formal training in philosophy and Greek, in theology. Her training in theology, by the way, is not a rabbinical school theology. It's pretty much Roman Catholic. This is where Augustine comes in. So the fascinating thing about Arendt is she's very consistent in her sort of disinterest, you could say, in her own individuational identity. She's able to and happy to show interest in things that she may not immediately identify with and really take them on their own terms and almost in some ways make them new and on her own terms in other ways as well. So like one of the jokes I make with some of my friends is that, I've never read a more Catholic Jewish thinker than Arendt. And in some ways, she's more Catholic than a lot of Catholic thinkers I read. Just the depth of her analysis and stuff. She has she's a treasure trove, in particular within the Catholic intellectual tradition. Although you can imagine many Catholics in the Catholic intellectual tradition are like, why is this Jewish? Why is Sam talking? Because I sometimes go on and on about, Arendt, good Catholics should read Arendt. They're like, why? She's not Catholic. Anyway, so she kind of starts off in Aristotle, and the big thing about Aristotle that Arendt really hones in on, and she talks about it even with Plato here, but it's in the interview in the best way. This idea of, I only love my friends. It can seem a curious or witty statement, but it's a statement that comes directly out of the Nicomachean ethics of Aristotle, so Aristotle's ethical system. In the Nicomachean ethics, Aristotle, so let's not, lots of A's up here, Arendt. Aristotle says, among friends, there is no need for justice. So in the Nicomachean Ethics, where Aristotle's trying to basically say, what are the conditions for the possibility of flourishing, right? What are the conditions of possibility of a good life? He spends a lot of time talking about justice because one of the more classical approaches to raising this as a political question is that, people tend to have a more flourish more under just conditions than in unjust conditions, right? This is almost a truism at this point. Aristotle, however, and this is an insight he gleans from Plato and that Arendt really captures in this statement, says, but we need not expect that justice or even the good, Plato's justice, which is the good, it's not justice, that this is like the horizon of possibilities. Among friends, we don't need these things. In other words, when friends get together, the law of ethics is suspended and the higher law of friendship is established. And so there's this idea of convivial relations among friends that suspends, you could say, the ethical and political demands of justice for Aristotle, of goodness for Plato, and Arendt likewise. You can see now what the incredible depth of her statement, I only love my friends. In other words, what she's saying is that the kind of order of friendship that operates at the level beyond ethics and beyond the politics of the good is love. Where does she get this idea? She gets it from the next guy, Augustine. Arendt dedicated her dissertation to the topic of on love in St. Augustine. So Arendt wrote literally the book on the role of love in the thought of the 5th century philosopher, Roman Catholic philosopher Augustine of Hippo. So you could see, though, how Arendt, in some ways, if justice and the good sort of run out of gas and friendship gets over the top, and if love is this thing she's sort of putting as the operating factor then she wants to understand what love is, right? And so she goes and looks at Augustine's treatment of love. There's a saying in Latin that she uses that is very Augustinian. I think there's a whole website dedicated to her under this phrase, amor mundi, which is love of the world. Right? There's a very particular sense of our relation to each other, our relation to ourselves, and our relation to the world, and kind of the degrees of import those take, and that in some ways you could say that the ability to love the world, not just to love one another, to love ourselves, but to love the world as it is a kind of a level of conviviality that maybe even goes beyond Aristotle's claim about friendship and that. But one of the things that Arendt is also fascinated with, and that fascinated her probably more than anything else in her later days, is the question of the problem of evil. The problem of evil in Augustine is a very simple to express problem. So Augustine presents it this way in a few places, but mainly in his Confessions. He says, so Scripture tells us that God is good and that God created all things. Yet within creation there are things that are bad. So is it the case that God, who is good and who created all things, made a mistake and accidentally created some things that were bad? Well, that would contradict the first premise of that syllogism. And on the other hand, and he works through this problem basically showing that there's a kind of an incompatibility thesis problem with the very real manifestation of evil, especially in the form of suffering, of perversity, of all these things in the world. And he tries to deal with it head on. The other reason Augustine is interested in this in the Confessions is that one of the really popular Roman ideas that was trying to critique Christianity was an idea called Manichaeanism. Manichaeanism is this kind of dualistic idea that the entire cosmos is divided between good and bad, and that good is every much the same quantity as bad. And so you have, as Augustine would put it, you have God on the side of the good, and you have Satan on the side of the bad, and they're fighting each other for power. And and at the end, you don't know who will win. You might say, oh shit, Manichaeism, God and Satan, this isn't. Well, if you think about some people's ideas of power, they're very Manichaean, where they sort of give everyone equal valences of power. It's just power rubbing against each other. Whoever wins, kind of comes out. In other words, this model of Manichaean power is something that's very pervasive, especially in like a Machiavellian idea of like realpolitik, where, political power is just, brute forces knocking against each other, in this kind of basic way. This wouldn't get to the level of micropolitics and Foucault and the stuff we talked about last week, but I think it's a common image of power that we have in our minds. Augustine claims that this Manichaean idea of evil, that gives evil, you could say, a kind of metaphysical order, is false. And so he comes up with the idea called the privation theory of evil. And I'll explain to you what that means in just one second. But whenever we hear Arendt say the banality of evil, which in and of itself, just that phrase set off so many people's emotions about, oh, she's saying evil is banal, not that it's powerful, the Manichaean version, right? She's not giving, she's saying people who are evil aren't even guilty for their evil, that she's blaming the Jews for their own problems and the Eichmann trials and this stuff like that. She doesn't love her people, right? Her bulk. Arendt is working, though, from a classical thesis of evil, philosophical thesis, but she's using it in a very modern context. And I think that we need to be able to appreciate it. And I have an example that's as contemporary as this last Monday at the U.S. presidential debate. And so I want to hopefully express not just what's classical about this, but also what's contemporary about it. For Arendt, it was sort of a deep moral enigma that in the post-war, even when Hitler rose to power, that there was a sort of a lack of moral language, and especially after the Shoah, that there was a sort of a lack of moral language to judge, to cry out, to describe what had taken place. And for her, this lack of moral language was the loss of a particular tradition of thinking of not only authority, but also of theological concepts that themselves aren't so much religious institutionally, but like the concept of hell, which she talks about a lot in here. So she says, Hitler, in this secular worldview at Nuremberg, couldn't even be damned to hell. We could just be killed, more or less humanely. Like, to her, this is like a deep-seated, not only problem of evil at a theoretical level, but the problem of the lack of the problem of evil, that we no longer have this sense of what evil is. We no longer have an imagination for salvation or damnation, or these things that may seem to us as like, well, good things we don't have those things, because then they send all the people they don't like there. Yeah, but whenever you save all the people you don't like from that, you also end up saving all these other moral monsters from being able to be described in ways that carry a kind of moral force about them. And so Arendt is moved, you could say, by the atrocities of her own time and the incapacities of her own time to have a moral language and a set of moral concepts that could properly assign them to those atrocities. So when she attends the Eichmann trials, as a journalist, by the way, not as a philosopher, and as we all know, she's not a philosopher, right? I have to say, I understand her point, but I'm very much with the reporter. Like, after reading her especially, it's like, oh yeah, forgot, yeah. By the way, one thing she was also saying was not just she's not a philosopher, but also that she's not a political scientist, right? So she has a double move going on there. She doesn't want to be with the philosophers, but she also doesn't want to be with the sociologists, right? She wants to claim that there's a sort of an integrity to political theory that is not reducible to political philosophy nor to political science. Right, and I think that's a really, really interesting, especially in a field of education that is very much stuck where we're not in a philosophy department. And if I have anything to do with it, we don't have to be social scientists if we don't want to, right? But getting back to the point, this is what Augustine's theory of evil is, that renders itself out in Arendt's anxiety about the lack of a notion of evil, the lack of a tradition or of an authority of evil in her own time. The privation theory of evil says, okay, there are differences between things that are form and that are matter, right? So the form of something can exist even if the material of the form may or may not exist. Aristotle puts this through substance and accident, right? There are substances that can exist even though the accidental properties can change, right? So for instance, our relations, our immediate relations, like my son is not me, right? My children are not me, but I believe that there is something substantial that we share that binds us in a certain kind of a way, that no accidental fighting or a thing can completely sever the substantial, relation that we have, right? For some people, this is controversial. We can talk about that, but that's the apparatus Augustine's working from. And so, is everyone aware of what a parasite is in biology? What is a parasite? I mean, what makes a parasite a parasite?
It feeds off of another living.
Sure. If a parasite is like all alone, what happens to the parasite?
It dies.
It can't exist, right? So a parasite is this particular kind of organism that has an entirely contingent existence on a host, right, that carries the parasite. So Augustine wants to say that, let's imagine...
So in that sense, like an embryo or a fetus would be a parasite too, right?
In some ways, yeah. Of course, there are different kinds of parasitic relationships, right? There are symbiotic relationships, there are destructive relationships. So, we don't want to carry the biological analogy too far. And also, this isn't what Augustine uses. I'm just trying to explain it, so I want to be careful. This is a shark. Really? Seriously? Come on. It's not so bad. Yeah, it's pretty bad. Yeah. And this is a parasite on the shark, right? The shark is the host. So here's what Augustine says. Augustine says, the Manichaeans want to say that good and evil are like two sharks fighting in the ocean. Evil is one shark, good is another shark, and they just fight against each other all the time. But the fact is that if we accept the premise that everything that God creates is good, then everything God creates is in some sense a shark. But then God creates this thing called freedom, which creates the possibility for other created beings to create things that are not good, yet that are somehow contingent to the goodness of their own creation, which gives them the freedom to create. And so we have the appearance of these parasitic things that we could call evil. But evil, in this case, can't be given the same metaphysical attributes as the good, which is the shark. So evil only exists as a contingent property of a prior established good. And so in every single case where we find a manifestation of evil, Augustine argues, that manifestation is always tethered at some depth and at some level to some infinite good. Believe it or not, this is Augustine, who is many times criticized for having a very kind of low opinion of sex and all these other kinds of things. Yet the implications of the metaphysical view of here is that basically there is no such thing as evil. In other words, there are no evil sharks. Everything is, at an order of creation, metaphysically good, and evil only manifests itself as a sort of property of a prior good. But there is no such thing as just evil, and then the evil bounces off and becomes a shark on its own or whatever. And so this fundamental relationship between evil and a prior metaphysical good, for Augustine, builds this theory of evil in which evil is not so much a thing, evil is simply the privation of goodness, but the privation of goodness implies goodness, right? That the goodness is there in a prior manifestation. So this theory is carried out through argument after argument after argument. I'm not going to go into the depths of what it is, but when we get it over to the banality of evil in Arendt, we can see, I think, very clearly what she's trying in some ways to do in a journalistic setting on the contemporary problem of our inability to appreciate the true evil manifestations of this manager carrying out the Shoah, right? Her claim in the Eichmann trials is principally to say that while the Manichaean modern world out there wants to say that Eichmann is a monster and Eichmann knew exactly what he was doing and Eichmann was some kind of mad genius who took Hitler's perverse ideas and turned them into reality by shipping people off. She said, no, the Eichmann I saw behind that booth was a bureaucrat, was a petty idiot. And he said as much. He said, I was just carrying out my orders. She says, this is an empirical manifestation of precisely the banality of evil. The fact that evil doesn't come to us as this big shark that wants to kill everything. Evil comes to us as this thing that is not even, properly speaking, a thing. Arendt insults Eichmann ultimately by saying the man isn't even a person. Which is to say, in order for something this terrible to happen, it's not that we have really bad people on the Manichaean version, but what we need is to have people who have been reduced to bureaucrats, who have been reduced to non-willed cogs in a wheel. And so if you want to match this up with a critique of neoliberalism, you can see that the problem with neoliberalism is not that it's creating heavy consumerist corporations that are going to wreak havoc on the world. This all may be true. But the real serious problem on an Arendtian view of neoliberalism is that it turns human beings into subhuman, non-personal bureaucrats who just do their job and who don't ask questions. And it's not that Bill Gates is a genius. Bill Gates is just a guy who got lucky and made a lot of money. And he has no idea what he's doing. But we give him this credit as this philanthropist, genius, blah, 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 right? But in fact, he's really just a CEO, which is just a really, really big, which is to say, tiny bureaucrat, right? And so the Arendtian reversal happens on the logic of this Augustinian theory of evil and this problem of evil both at a theoretical level but also at a concrete level. Yeah?
So, but Augustine was extremely religious. So in Arendt's opinion, Augustine accidentally made the situation in which good and evil no longer have that theological basis.
Augustine was very religious as a bishop, but as a philosopher, he was, and this is what Arendt argues here, he was basically, like most early Christians, just stealing playbooks from the Romans and the Greeks. So what she really reads in Augustine is just a consistency going back to Roman antiquity, back to the Greeks, whatever. And she really, and the manifestation of his religion, as she talks about here, was just the new system of authority. But she pretty much gives him credit for being, and in fact, in here she says, the only philosopher of the Roman era, right? She kind of says that this is the only guy who kind of really kind of worked this out from a Platonic, Aristotelian, Greek, Hellenic kind of thing.
From a place of personal questioning, it seems as though he's legitimately trying to work out his own faith.
Oh, sure.
Accidentally.
That's good.
To undermine it.
Yeah. It's, okay, that's a different question, but it's a harder one. Because you're right, because when you read the Confessions, he's also trying to deal with his own struggle to believe, his own doubts, right?
But she says that the good evil shark thing is undermining theology in the place that it was in before as the form of authority.
Oh,
So
I see.
He's
I see.
accidentally undermining.
I guess you could say that. Yeah, I see your point now. I thought you were going way into self-introspection, and you could say that. But here's the thing, and I think Arendt knows this. Only people who don't know anything about theology, and which includes a lot of very religious people, don't realize that one of the least controversial ideas about good and evil is that basically evil doesn't exist, right? And where this rubs up against other things, like politically, for instance, is very difficult. So for Arendt, though, it's really a metaphysical problem that I'm not quite. It could subvert, I suppose. And by the way, the reason this hits me is because I really like Augustine. I talk about Augustine a lot to Catholics, and when I talk to Augustine to Catholics, a lot of times they lose it. They're just heresy alert, right? This guy's and I'm like, no. This is I'm more conservative than you are. I actually read the books, the old books, right? But so there are some people who see it as a subversion of religion. I don't know if.
But in the text, I'm going to have to find it.
No, that's fine.
Refer to it. But
Yeah.
in the text, she talks about how there not being those extremes of good and evil, which were being taken from a religious lifestyle.
Sure.
Is changing the way that people are just perceiving the idea of ethics, right?
Yeah.
So without those good and evil, without that good and evil, the focus on religion has shifted.
Oh, I see. Yeah, she does say that, and then and I think here what she talks about as hell is a little bit different.
Mm-hmm.
And I wouldn't associate, by the way, the kind of Platonic idea of hell that becomes institutionalized in Christianity and gets kind of lost in modernity as exactly the same question of evil in this case. In some ways, I'm probably working more closely from the Eichmann book than I am from this book. But the reason I'm working from it is to show you that. So Arendt's trying to say that evil is banal. That is to say, it's the absence of a will or of a person. It reduces us down. It doesn't build us up. It's not strong. And so you can see perhaps one of the inspirations behind my claim that no politics without a polis, how an empire is not political, right, is in the same kind of sense of saying, whenever we have imperial authority, although my idea of imperialism is very different than her very clear idea of imperialism here. That's kind of embarrassing to read hers. I was like, Yeah, she's way smarter than me. But this idea of the empire as this force of domination across, we like to think of that as this very Manichaean, right, encounter between even sometimes the small good people and the big bad empire. And I was like, well, on a moral evaluation, in some sense, this imposition kind of isn't, it's not even political. It's just resorting to violence, which is something she also distinguishes there too. So, these are the fault lines. But hopefully you can see that when she goes to the Eichmann and Jerusalem trials and says that Adolf Eichmann is in some sense unable to be guilty, she's in some sense dehumanizing Eichmann. The ultimate insult. Not trying to say that he gets a pass and instead we should blame the Jewish community. This is a fundamental metaphysical, philosophical misunderstanding that has plagued, unfortunately, this book for, about 40 years, 50, gosh, it's been a while now, huh? Almost 60 years now. And I just want to be really clear that even though she didn't pull out Augustine word for word, it's really clear to me, and it's not even ambiguous, that given her work on Augustine, that this is the predominant theory working here. And it's a theory that's both theological, it's both classical, it's philosophical, but it's also really contemporary. So when I get to Monday at like Trump stuff, what's so fascinating to me, reading all the think piece literature coming out of Trump, is the fact that we still, especially American society, lacks a moral language that can once and for all just vanquish the clear manifestation of a certain kind of evil, right? So like my children, they see Trump on TV, they see him yelling, and they're immediately repulsed by him, right? They also don't quite have a language either. Maybe someday if they will, but as a secular society, it's fascinating to me to see Clinton up there having to treat Trump as an equal, right? Because this is what liberal society is, right? It's fair, open elections, all this stuff. And we believe that this process that produces such a clear manifestation of a certain kind of evil that even a child can pick up through all the intangibles there, that we're supposed to maintain like our liberal society cool, right? And we're supposed to let the process carry through. And we're even prepared, the last question of the debate, would you accept the other if they're elected? Even Hillary says, well, I believe in democracy. This to me is a striking example of precisely what this idea of crisis means. It's the point at which you can no longer say in a political way what is manifestly true, because the political organization has bought at a very expensive price an amount of freedom that prevents you anymore from talking using or communicating using these heavy moral, ethical, political, theological ways of arousing the imagination. And so, for me, this is what's interesting about like the civil rights movement. Then I need to get over to crisis. Is that like it's no coincidence that the blatant racism of Jim Crow that for 100 years followed, the blatant racism of institutional slavery, was not addressed by liberal, democratic, white politicians. It was addressed overtly by the black church, by ministers. Martin Luther King, well, I guess Lincoln used that moral language too at that time. But it's no coincidence that King, from a Christian Baptist perspective, or X from a NOI, Nation of Islam, Islamic perspective, or other, were able to speak at racism in a unique register that Kennedy, a Catholic, had no ability to replicate, right, and no ability to understand. And so I think that whether it's Trump, whether it's civil rights, whether it's the Shoah, the Holocaust, whether it's Manichaeans in 4th century, or if it's in schools, right? When I was younger, I was a lot more living out of my more religious formation, and so I had a teacher ask me a question that literally hit me upside the head because I never thought of it. They said, what if you have, this was in Ohio, it was a very reasonable question, what if you have like a white supremacist in your classroom and their parents have raised them to believe that white people are a superior race? And what if I was teaching an ethics and teaching course, and what are your moral responsibilities there? Well, my immediate reaction was like, well, that's a really stupid question. You tell them their parents are wrong, and and you kind of and you get on with your life. And it became clear to me though that like, whoa, I gave the wrong answer in that classroom. Now, I'm not morally convicted that it was the wrong answer, but I violated a particular politic of liberal society, a kind of notion of justice, a view of equality, of democracy. I was basically operating from what were probably at that time, I think I was 24, 25, basically a religious apparatus. That it was natural for me to just condemn evil as like sinful, right? If you read critical race theory or like even the theoretical work on racism, anti-racism, if you replace the word sin for words like racism, the text becomes much more clear. And I don't know why. Maybe just to me, because I share this kind of way of thinking. But you notice how like the entire critical social justice agenda is in some sense trying to find a substitutionary logic for sin, for evil, for hell, for damnation, because there are real harms out there today, right? And we have to find a way in which we can talk about those harms as harms that actually threaten people in a moral, political, active way. Yet as a society, we've largely cashed in those chips. Yet now we find that we're unable to maybe we'd like to use them, or maybe we rely on people who have them to use them, to help people out or whatever. But this is very much Arendt, the Jewish woman, Arendt, the Catholic theologian, Arendt, the philosopher, coming to bear on this particular problem and the significance of obviously post-war Germany. Now, how does that relate though to crisis? Because what I've described here so far is a notion of crisis. Here I'll be very brief because it's fairly technical. Yes, Arendt was a student and more of Martin Heidegger's. That's fine. I honestly, it kind of puts me off a bit because I think there's something really sexist about the fact that Arendt's relationship to Heidegger is so overblown, because it's not like all these other male philosophers have been like asexual and not doing things, but all of a sudden Arendt decides to like have a fling with her teacher, and she's the one who gets talked about when all these teachers are mostly having multiple affairs and having it. To me, there's something deeply sexist about this particular narrative of, and then, oh, but he was a Nazi, so she must have been sympathetic. And that's what about the movie really bothers me. I did watch the movie, just to be sure. So I'm going to, hopefully, I really want to refrain from dignifying that particular commentary, because it's not as important to me as Heidegger's teacher, also Jewish, who Heidegger actually turned in to the party, or turned in his name. Thankfully, Husserl was able to flee. Edmund Husserl. Because I think we can understand better these two parts when we understand Husserl, which really motivate the relationship between Arendt and this movement called phenomenology. Edmund Husserl is arguably the founder of the tradition and of the school of thought known as phenomenology, a school of thought and a tradition that, full disclosure, I consider myself a part of and working in. Right? I'll talk a little bit about what that is after I settle the biographical details. Husserl was around at the turn of the 20th century. He was the student, although he was a Jew, secular Jew, like Arendt. He was a student of Franz Brentano, an Austrian former Dominican priest. Dominicans, if you think back, are the order that takes a vow of fidelity to the teachings of Thomas Aquinas, the scholastic guy from Paris. So there's this tradition of Dominican... Franz Brentano, Brentano. And Husserl studied under Brentano. There were some other students of Brentano's that became really important. But one idea that Brentano came up with was really the one that Husserl latched onto and used to create the movement called phenomenology. The word is intentionality. When I normally say the word intent or intentionality, we usually mean making plans for something. So like, I intend to go to Kerner's and drink a beer and have dinner, right? So my intentionality, you could say, in ordinary language, is to go to Kerner's. Right? This is not what the word means for Brentano. For Brentano, intentionality refers to the fact that consciousness, human consciousness, is never just generically floating up there conscious in the air somewhere. Consciousness is always conscious of something. So there's no such thing as a consciousness that is simply conscious. That is in some sense it's what he would call psychologism. It's to describe psychological entities in non-psychological terms. Consciousness for Brentano, which becomes really important for Husserl, our psychology is always object-directed. That's what it means for something to be intentional in the phenomenological sense. So intentionality for Husserl, as he took from his teacher Brentano, refers first and foremost to the intentionality of our consciousness, for which phenomenology, which is nothing more than the study of appearances, for which phenomenology becomes the sort of approach to philosophy and to study that, as Husserl puts it, takes us to the things themselves. What does that mean? To the things themselves means to the things of which our intentionality is always directed towards, right? So the things themselves are the objects that our consciousness is always object-directed towards. Now,
I was wondering if you could give an example of that.
Sure. Which one?
The things are only directed towards the objects, like with the phenomenology.
Sure. So it's based on kind of like at the time they actually used the word psychology and phenomenology interchangeably. Psychology hadn't really quite completely been invented yet. And so phenomenology and psychology kind of got made up at the same time. And so it's in some sense a psychological theory. It's basically the view that you can't just pay attention. So try to pay attention. What's the first thing you have to ask, right? Exactly. That's it's. So we can't just pay attention. We always pay attention to something, right? We always pay attention in an intentional way. We don't just have attention, right? So because of this aspect of consciousness, of this aspect of our psychology, Husserl says there are numerous occasions in which we fail to be sufficiently object-directed in our approach. And this leads to the problem of what I said earlier, psychologism. Psychologism is simply when mental or psychological entities are described through non-psychological analogies. So whenever we say pay attention and you say of what, you're basically saying you're not really talking about attention, because attention is always intentional. So, give me a better command than just pay attention. That doesn't make any sense. That's psychologistic. It also means whenever non-psychological entities are described using psychological descriptions. So whenever we say this essay argues that blah, 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 that's psychologistic, because essays don't have intentions and consciousness. Essays don't argue. People argue. So you should substitute for this essay for I, in this essay, will argue. That's a non-psychologistic way to talk about something. Now this might sound kind of trivial, but in a particular text that Husserl wrote called Crisis of the European Sciences, which is called Crisis, Husserl takes this two-pronged kind of idea of phenomenology and says, because of the intentionality of human consciousness, and because of the problem of psychologism in the modern sciences, the crisis at present in what he calls the modern sciences, which he's referring to basically the sciences of economy, of early sociology, anthropology, naturalism, basically the early empirical sciences. He says these sciences work on some fundamental problems that in some sense make them irredeemable for the future. And if we continue to trust these sciences, these modern sciences, we will just create a more profound crisis in our society. One of the main claims he makes is that the structure of consciousness is not mathematical. Numbers can be studied psychologically, can be studied phenomenologically to create a philosophy of number. But to analogize psychology based on principles of mathematics or even of logic is to psychologize consciousness. So, what Husserl argues is that the things themselves, the objects that things are directed at, need to correspond to what they are. So if we're studying social sciences, if we're studying people, then to use a mathematical or logical analogy to make sense of them would be to commit a psychologistic error and to ultimately undignify the actual objects and the things themselves we're studying by denying them their intentionality. So we would basically reduce people into not so much objects, but into objects that do not correspond to what they actually are as intentional subjects. Yeah, Kelsey?
Sorry, I'm...
Yep.
Okay, so what he's saying is that the problem is that we are describing objects not that in a way that don't correlate to what they are. Is this what...
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Okay.
Good. Yeah, no, that's all it is. But in particular, he has a real beef with the objects that have intentionality, which is objects that have consciousness, namely persons, people, right? Social things. And the fact that when we study appearances, the appearances may or may not have consciousness, but the study implies the phenomenologist, right? So everything happens within our consciousness. It's Kantian in this sense, right? It's all captured by consciousness. So for Husserl, crisis emerges in the European modern sciences by their false reliance on mathematical and logical analogs that are supposedly supposed to be explanatory of intentional subjects. And this creates a fundamental scientific, mathematical, philosophical, phenomenological problem and crisis. And this is, you could say, the foundational view that even those of us who have parted ways with certain aspects of, you could say, the doctrine of phenomenology, this is the Nicene Creed, right? If you are a phenomenologist, you believe basically in this idea of intentionality. In my work, I think we believe maybe too much in it, but that's very different than it's saying that I don't believe in it, right? And you also believe in this problem of psychologism, which comes up in various ways. I believe, and here I'm speaking as a phenomenologist, so this is propaganda, right? So you don't need to take it. I believe that if you want to understand the basic fundamental problems of educational research, they're largely reducible to this basic problem. It's not just a problem with positivism. It's a simple misunderstanding. And the reason I'm really giving this more time than I should is because when we read Freire will often talk about the reduction of subjects into objects. Over and over he'll talk about this. Freire was steeped in phenomenology. He quotes Husserl in Pedagogy of the Oppressed. We'll see it. Freire understood that there's also a narrative of oppression within this phenomenological sense of crisis. That the only way you can oppress someone is if you deny them their intentionality, the intentional structure of their consciousness. Finally, and I know I'm really blowing it here, sorry. Getting back to Arendt's description of Eichmann, Arendt is trying to oppress Eichmann. She is trying to oppress him by saying, you have degraded yourself to a bureaucrat, and you have denied yourself of the dignity of having an intentional consciousness. You're not even capable of killing people because you can't even think. Right? That's the substance of her critique of Eichmann, which was read by lots of political interests as like, oh, she gave him a pass. No, she did not give him a fucking pass. She gave him the worst possible, most degrading description she could think of, which is that you are not able to think. And this is where Heidegger did have an enormous impact on Arendt's thought, and I think rightly so. For Heidegger, the Husserlian notion of phenomenology really boils down to this small essay he wrote called what is called thinking. For Heidegger, to think is to, in some sense, claim or reclaim the intentional structure of our consciousness and put it into application by the study of appearances, and then by the attempt to do that in a way that is as object-directed and to the things themselves as possible. In doing so, Heidegger actually critiqued heavily his teacher, Husserl, on saying that objects take for granted the being of the object. So he moves from the object to the being of the object. That's what's called ontology in the word. First time the word has been used, I think, in this class. That's what the word actually means. I don't know what people mean when they use that word elsewhere. And so Arendt, in her own work, is basically calling us to think. That's all. But when she wants us to think, she doesn't just mean, don't be Eichmann. That's what she means. Don't be a petty fucking bureaucrat, right? Don't just take orders. Don't just do as you're told. Think. And for Arendt, the dignity of the praxis of thinking is beyond theory. She's not a philosopher. And it's beyond practice. She's not an activist, even though she has activist street cred for sure in her own works. But for Arendt, the most liberating thing we can do is to think, right? And thinking is not just theorizing. It's not memorizing names and dates. And it's also, though, not picketing and striking necessarily. It's maybe memorizing names and dates, but thinking. And maybe it's picketing and striking and blowing up stuff. Yes, but thinking, right? And so it's that aspect of thought, which is not just consciousness, but intentional thought, that is really shows what the privation is in her account of evil, and furthermore, what love becomes in the presence of her friends. Justice and the good ultimately boss us around because they're part of a moral bureaucracy that forces us to do things based on things. But whenever we are with our friends, we are freed from the bureaucratic politics of ethics, and we're allowed to enter into, you could say, the pure politics of love. And it's in that manifestation where we're most free to exercise this thing here called intentionality, where we're not doing it because it's the right thing to do, we're doing it because we love the thing itself, out of love for the other that's complete and total and has no room to be bossed around by ethics. So deeply inside of Arendt's theory is an almost post-ethical imperative that we cannot trust laws or even politics itself in this sense, and certainly not goodness or justice or equality or those things. We need to strive for, you could say, this amor mundi, this bigger kind of more capacious version of things. And she, to this day, has been nothing but misunderstood, in my opinion. I don't agree with her, by the way. But I do feel very defensive because she has been largely framed in ways that I think are both deeply sexist and have to do with the fact that she was a woman. Like, you know, ha ha ha, Heidegger. It's like, oh, fuck off. If we go into affairs of every philosopher, there'll be much more ha ha ha's for other people than for her. But also this question of her relationship to her people, the Jewish people. And I think this misunderstanding cuts across a lot of different places. And so if you want to read a good explanation of that, the last thing I'll say, the introduction to the Penguin Classics edition is actually quite good. I think it talks a lot about the reception in Israel and how different that reception was than in the United States. And the movie really misrepresents that. The movie makes it seem, the popular movie, that the Israeli contingent were just as offended as the American was. And it wasn't. That wasn't really the case at all, at least argues this guy. But anyway, that's the background of Arendt and some of these big pillars of her thought. Any questions? Yeah?
How do you disagree with her?
Oh, geez.
After the break, after the break.
Yeah. Yeah, no. We'll take a break, but we'll jump in with the disagreements. I mean, yeah. To just be clear, I disagree with her out of more a sense of deference than out of a, disagreement.
No, I don't mean how is it possible. I mean,
Oh.
in what ways? Like,
I think she could have just stuck with the phenomenology thing and not needed to take phenomenology into the political. And I'd say my project is in some sense there, so of course I think she would have helped me more if she had done that. But I understand it, so I don't hold any of my critiques against her. But yeah, that's one thing. All right, so we're going to take a quick break. Let's say full 15 minutes, all right? 15 minutes, and we'll come back.